The loss of a loved one can leave you feeling depressed, angry, alone, lost. But you don't have to face this journey on your own. Open to Hope is a free community for anyone who has experienced loss. Find support. Find help. Find hope. Give grief a voice at Open to Hope. For more information, find us at opentohope.com.
Hello, I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, and welcome to our show today. And my co-host is
Dr. Heidi Horsley,
who is my daughter, I'm happy to say. And Heidi, we have a great show on today because on our site at opentohope.com, we find that the #1 visit from people is parent loss. Right, Heidi?
absolutely. That's where people are going that have had parents die and where they're going and trying to find hope again after loss. And like you said, it's the #1 thing that people search for on our site.
Which is interesting because we think of parent loss, you know, as a little kid losing their parent. These are adult people who've lost their parents and are coping with it throughout a lifetime. And we've got a couple of guests today who are going to give you some good thoughts and advice on parent loss. Heidi, do you want to introduce our guests?
Sure, I'd love to. And both of our guests have had parents that have died when they were growing up. And our first guest is going to be Rachael Stephenson. Rachael is an advocate for honest and open discussion regarding grief. Rachael's mother died in an automobile accident when she was just a child, and she was unable to discuss the death of her mother with her father, and her father died of alcoholism in 2013. We will also show you a clip from Rachael's TED Talk, Against Grieving in Silence. And then, Mom, we're going to hear from John Welshons. John is a counselor, teacher, and lecturer. He is the author of Awakening from Grief and One Soul, One Love, One Heart. And he is an expert in grief and loss and goes all over the world speaking about it and working with people that have had a loss.
Yeah. So we think you're going to enjoy this show today because there's a lot of commonality with John and Rachael, and they're going to be able to give you some good tips on how to deal with parent loss. Well, Rachael, welcome to our show today.
Hi, Rachael.
Thank you so much, Heidi and Gloria, for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's great to have you on, and I think it's amazing. Your TED Talk, what was the name of it again?
Against Grieving in Silence.
Yeah. And such an important thing, such an important topic about grieving in silence. Talk a little bit about your background and what happened to you.
Well, my mom died when I was 5 in a car accident. It happened one night when I was at my grandmother's house, as I often was on the weekends, because my parents were very young and would go out with their friends so that they could live their lives. You know, my grandmother woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me that my mommy was sick and that she had to go.
Oh, wow.
And the next morning she came home with my dad. I didn't know where they had gone, and they weren't with my mom. She wasn't there. And my dad simply said to me, "Your mommy's in heaven now. She's with the angels."
Wow.
So, you know, starting from that moment in time, he didn't say the words. He didn't say what had happened, and neither did my grandmother. So I began a journey as a child, a motherless child, of trying to figure out what had happened, and presumed for many, many years that my mom was sick. And what that meant to me as a kid, I mean, I couldn't really say to anyone. I imagined her in a bed with a thermometer hanging off her lips. Years later, I learned from a family member that she had died in a car accident, and then suddenly felt not only the grief of having lost my mom, but anger and confusion.
Yeah,
right?
I would imagine you, all those years you didn't even know any of the details. Or did you go to her funeral?
I did not.
So you didn't,
I did
she
not.
just disappeared one day?
She disappeared. I mean, literally disappeared, because I did not go to her funeral, and also photos of her went away. And
Wow.
and I know, I mean, obviously, in retrospect, I realized that my family, they were trying to protect me, right? I mean, they were doing what they thought was best.
Do you know what I think, rather than, being a parent who's had a son die with Heidi, more than protection is that I couldn't stand to see my kids upset. at that level. I mean, you know, it's very hard to see a 5-year-old crying and there's nothing you can do for them.
That's right.
You know, it's really, you know, shattering.
I'm also thinking of Rachel too, because I'm thinking, how would it be to be 5 and older as you're growing up and not being able to talk about your mom, not all of a sudden she just disappears out of your life. You don't have really any details about what happened. That must have been scary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you know, there are things that happen that I've learned since that I don't have conscious memories of. For instance, you know, when I finally was able to talk to my grandmother about it, this is when I was in college, after I'd written about the loss, because that's the way I chose to process it and really confront it. You know, she and I had a very long and intense conversation about, you know, what had happened, and she started to shed light on these things that had been hidden away in the darkness, right, for so many years. And one of the things that she shared with me was that for weeks after my mom died, I would wake up in the middle of the night screaming for her.
Wow.
And my dad would go into the bedroom, you know, he and my grandmother were living with me at the time, and you know, eventually I would quiet down. And I don't remember what was happening in those moments, and I wish I did, right? Because much of what I think about now is the fact that my dad and I never did talk about what happened, I mean, up until his death. And as I think about the way he lived his life, you know, after she was gone, I realized that he was repressing a lot of the grief, and I wish that he and I had been able to actually talk about
And this was with alcohol, and I know that you talk about the fact that he actually came to live with you and started drinking again and then died.
That's
So-
right, that's right. I mean,
How many years ago was this that he died?
he died in 2013.
Okay, so it's only been a couple of years.
It has, it's just been a couple of years. And honestly, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I am so interested in really mining this experience now and doing it in a public way, because I think now that he's gone, and I really did lose him before his death, right? Because for so many years there was emotional distance between us, and the alcoholism and other, you know, pills and other things that he had turned to took over his life and our relationship.
Yeah.
And but I realize now that with a little bit of distance from his death, and because I am so desperate to find a way back to him, you know, now is the time to talk about these losses, and also to think about how the night of my mother's death really does represent the loss of my dad too.
Yeah.
Because I think he was never able to emotionally recover, and he was so destroyed by what happened. He was driving the car, by the way, that you know, was hit. They were hit, and he watched her die.
Wow.
And so, knowing that night really was the beginning of his fate and the fate of our relationship, now that he's gone, I really am positioned to think about it and be reflective and share, because I think there's a moral to the story.
I think it's so great that you're sharing. Was it scary to go on the TED Talk, and how did you prepare for it? I mean, it's pretty amazing. We're going to show a little clip because there you are, you know, standing up on this red platform, and wow.
Right. You know, I have been waiting for this opportunity, honestly. And I feel, for me, I felt like that talk represented a kind of threshold for me. You know, my whole life I've been an educator and a program director, and, you know, I've pursued a career, and I've thought so much about my mom's death, and I've, you know, wrestled with my relationship with my dad and written about it, but it's been very private, and I haven't connected with people about this at all. And so for me, that talk, knowing that it was going to happen, was an opportunity to cross this threshold and really say out loud what was happening. And I had hoped that it would be the beginning of this, right? I mean, an opportunity to come and talk to you and the people who are watching and other people, so that this story becomes, you know, part of the narrative that we're all trying to figure out and share.
You know what I really love about this, Heidi, is that Rachael, this happened, you know, so many years ago, the beginning of it, and you're able to come out and talk about it. So important for people to hear. Part of it is it's never too late.
Right. And I also like how honest you are about what was going on with your dad. First of all, that he was so destroyed and distraught, and then that he later became an alcoholic, because a lot of people hide how people have died, and the only way we're going to reach out and really help people that might be going through something similar is to tell our story and tell the truth about it.
Absolutely. And one thing that I've thought about, and something I was afraid of, honestly, was that I didn't want people to judge my dad, right? And I didn't want to make it seem like I did it right and he did it wrong, because the talk does contrast the way that we handle things. And he went down this path of isolation and, retreated from me, and I tried to say things out loud and ask questions. And by no means am I wanting to indict him or say that he did it wrong, because I realized that he and my grandmother, his mother, who ended up raising me, I mean, he was young and he had to live his life, and she took me in and sacrificed everything. And she was part of the silence. We were all complicit in the silence. And as I grew up and realized I didn't want to live that way, now I'm able to say what I want to say. But a really important part of the story for me is to find a way to give dimension to them, my father, right, and to create empathy for him. And it's really only now that I know as much as I do about what he experienced. And it's really not because he told me, it's because I've heard from his friends. And after his death, people have connected with me, and I have been able to bear witness to his story in ways that I never could before. Now, my empathy for him is so much greater, and that's why I do want to reach back and reconnect in ways that we weren't able to in life. And so I think part of this story is finding the empathy for people who are struggling with this, because,
and the more you can find the empathy, the more that you heal.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I have such peace now, and I know it will get better, and but I have so much more peace now than I did when he died. I mean, I was a wreck and numb, actually. I mean, I've thought at times, was I as upset as I should have been, when he died? But because I had lost him already to some degree, there was this numbing effect that it had on me. But now that I am finding this empathy and trying to tell his story in addition to mine, it's not just about my story, it's about his too, and my grandmother's eventually. I want to be able to get at this from different angles. I am feeling some real peace, and I think it's the opportunity to connect with you and others that is creating that.
So Rachel, I'm wondering, okay, so you're really an expert on what it feels like to be a bereaved child where no one is talking about it. So for parents out there that have children that are going through a loss, what would you say to them? What advice would you give them in how to deal with the kids?
Please look them in the eyes and tell them what has happened.
Okay.
Or what is happening. I think a lot of people think that kids can't handle it, that things are too dark or too scary. But what I realize now is that by trying to protect me, my family ultimately ended up complicating things a little bit for me, because when I ended up realizing what had actually happened, not only did I have my grief to live with and deal with, but I had all of this confusion about why were there secrets, and why didn't I know everything, and that doesn't need to be a part of the equation.
I'm thinking too, if our audience is watching this now and it's been down the road, it's never too late. I mean, that's the other thing. It's never too late to write your story. I know you started out by writing it, and maybe that's where, rather than confronting people right away or asking right away, you might want to write some things about it and approach it that way if you need to do it a softer way. But let's take a look at your TED Talk, and then let's bring John in and have him comment on his background, which is pretty similar, and some similarities, and also let's get his comments on your story.
Okay. There's a black and white picture of my mom at the age of 16 hanging on the wall of my living room. She's resting her chin in the palm of her hand, and she's actually wearing this ring, a blue star sapphire that my father gave her. My 3 daughters see that picture every day. My 3-year-old has actually started pointing to it and saying, "That's not my mommy, that's my grandma." "Yes, that's mommy's mommy," we all say. Months ago, my 7-year-old sat next to me and said, a little out of nowhere, "Your mommy and dad are dead. You have no parents." "That's true," I responded. I looked at her green-gray eyes, her lashes, her eyebrows, and she looked right back at me.
Then she put her head on my chest, and I rested my chin on the top of her head. I savor these moments when my girls talk out loud about my mom and my dad, and they wrestle a bit with their absence. You know, they have to work things out in their head about what my parents might have been to them and how we as a family can weave them into our lives and how to navigate death's disruptiveness. I mean, this is really important stuff. I know some people say it's too much for kids, it's too heavy, it's too dark, it's too complicated, but I adamantly disagree. My experience has taught me that grief needs to be heard. And this kind of openness can be life-saving.
That's absolutely a fabulous TED Talk that you did, and the idea that grief needs to be heard, you're certainly bringing it out. Welcome on the show, John.
Thank you.
Hi, John.
You were a teenager when your mother died, but you had some alcoholism in the family and all that kind of thing. I wondered what your comment and thought is on Rachel's story.
Well, the first thing I would say is just how courageous you are for bringing this out into the open. And what a relief that must be for you, because, you know, dealing with that kind of what Elizabeth used to call denial.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the author of On Death and Dying.
That's right, very same. You know...
What was it you said, you were going to say that she said? I just wanted our audience to know.
Well, I think that living in denial about the truth of what's happening, which happens in your case, compounded by the fact that most people who live with alcoholism are living in a state of denial because generally the family's pretending it's not happening. The experience of losing your mother at the age of 5 and having this pretense of, you know, mommy's in heaven, or, you know, but what does that mean? And your statement now, more recently, saying, you know, if this kind of thing happens, look your children in the eye and tell them what's happening. Someone said to me, asked me a number of years ago, how do I help my children to not be afraid of death? And I looked at this man and I said, deal with your own fear about death.
Yeah.
Because I think that children pick up what's in the environment. And I remember getting this message, not through something as dramatic as what your experience was, but basically growing up in the 1950s, getting the message that death is something that's so bad we don't talk about it. And I, looking back on it, realized that the message I got was it's so bad the big people can't deal with it.
I think that, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at before. I mean, it is so hard to deal with seeing your kids cry over an event. And when you're feeling horrible, and then there's kids are supposed to make you happy and be fun, and they're not making you happy, it's getting even worse. I mean, how low can we go?
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I have 3 daughters now, and I think this is another reason I'm starting to do this, because having them confront this kind of stuff is really important.
Yeah.
And at one point, you know, I've said to them, and I say in the talk, that it's okay to be in pain, right? And if we accept that pain is a part of life, I mean, loss is the flip side of love, you know? I mean, it's part of the landscape. And I want them as children to understand that it's part of what we have to deal with. And if we can do it together, it's better than doing it alone.
Indeed.
My granddaughter's roommate at college, her mother died, and she was there for them and talked to her and all that, and her friends were saying, I can't believe you can talk about this, and she said, well, that's because you haven't met my grandma and my aunt. So, but it is a gift to the world. I mean, your TED Talk is a gift to the world, and your workshops and all the work you do is a gift to say, you know, let's not, I mean, it's going to happen to everybody.
And
I mean,
grieve
you
in
know.
silence, and let's not have it in silence, especially with children, with anybody.
Yeah.
You need to talk about it.
Exactly.
And allow them to talk about it.
Well, John, I wanted you to talk about a couple of things that we can do if we're grieving, a couple of suggestions you might have, besides talking about it, which we need to.
Yeah. And I wanted to pick up on something you were saying to Rachel, which is that it's never too late. And I always recommend that people create a space of honor in their homes for the person who has died, so you can sit and talk to them and carry on the relationship and say all the things that were never said or that you feel you would like to have said. And then I think that what you're asking about is also some other tools and techniques like yoga and meditation. Yoga is a wonderful way to quiet the body down, because we store so much of our sadness and agitation in our bodies. And just getting into a yoga class where you have an opportunity to work through those emotions at the physical level, and that ultimately paves the way for the ability to meditate, which is the single most useful tool that I've ever found in my life for dealing with processing life and the difficulties in life and finding a way to be joyful and peaceful. But I would recommend starting with yoga because...
I didn't know that. I've got to tell you, I never knew that starting with yoga
I didn't either.
was where you should start and then move into meditation. I always thought it was the opposite.
Well, meditation can be so difficult for people.
Yes, that's...
Especially if you've
Completely.
had a loss, your mind is just
That's right.
going
Yes.
Yeah.
bananas.
And it will put you into your feelings. So that is intimidating to a lot of people because that's where they don't want to go. So if you start with yoga, it's a little more gentle. You're
Wow.
working it through in your body first and then working into meditation practice.
I actually started doing yoga about a year after my son was killed in an automobile accident, and and I've been doing it ever since. And I find it really useful, and
Did you
really
start
helpful.
it because Scott died?
You know, we went to Canyon Ranch,
Okay.
an exercise place, and they had yoga, and I
And
just
you probably
happened
went there because Scott died.
Yeah, we went there because he died to get, to try to find some exercises and try to get ourselves pulled together. And then I took a yoga class and never looked back. But it was a very beginning class. It was just, I think it was one teacher and a couple of students saying, okay, this is how you stand. And I said, I've been standing all my life. And suddenly I found out that I could stand differently.
New information.
And that was the,
Well,
the
and I
beginning.
think you're making a good point, though, because I think it can be very intimidating for someone that's never done yoga to think about that first initial going into a yoga studio in a class. And like you're saying, you don't have to be a yogi to do yoga.
Yeah.
You don't even have to be flexible. I mean, you can do a restorative class, and it will shift your energy and change the way you feel, and it's very relaxing. So
Funny that
just-
people often say, I can't do yoga because I'm not flexible.
Yes.
It's sort of like saying, I can't play the piano because I've never had lessons. Yoga is designed to help us become flexible
Yeah.
at whatever level of inflexibility we start at.
Yeah. And if you don't want to do yoga, I will tell you, if you walk for 20 minutes a day, it will reduce your risk of stroke by 50%. And I think people who've had a loss, particularly if you're older, it is very stressful. It's physically, extremely stressful. I think sometimes we think about grief and loss as being all in the head, and the body takes a real blow.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so important. Well, regarding death of a parent, were you surprised it's such a big thing?
It's such a big thing.
In their
Yeah,
life,
to have
you
a
mean?
parent die. I mean, an adult parent. I mean, I just don't think the world gets it.
Well,
That
yeah.
having an adult parent die is difficult.
Yeah, and
I think it surprises people too.
it does. And I think especially in the baby boom generation, I see, because that's what I am, and I see so many people, friends of mine, who call me up when their parents die and say, I just wasn't prepared for this at all.
Yeah.
And I wasn't prepared for how profound it was going to be and how it was going to make me emotional. And, it just was something I never really thought about or prepared for.
Well, you've been in your whole, you've never known your life without your parents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you lost your mother young, but you never knew your life without her. You never knew your life without your mother, and now your father. All of a sudden, you're in this new world going, wait a minute, my parents aren't here.
Yeah.
And so much of what we do is to make our parents proud or to get their attention or, it's connected to our parents.
Well, I would add too that, as adults we have unresolved things with our parents, and you know, when I think about loss as a child, you think, well, wow, there was so much that wasn't done, or but even losing my dad, I mean, things were not resolved between the two of us, and so I think that leaves you feeling raw.
And it's never going to happen.
Right.
Yeah. You know, however, there are things people do like writing and forgiveness things and collages, and there are all sorts of creative things to deal with. But you said something that resonated with me too. You said, I don't know if I felt right about my dad dying, if it was enough, or how I felt. And you know what? I think that's part of the conflict that comes with it. If you've had problems with a parent or whatever, or if they've been sick and they do die, you know, you're supposed to feel they're not in pain anymore. And, you know, it can be very confusing. And also, I have to say that I've, you know, at an age where I've lost both my parents naturally, and I have to say that there is something about being the next one that I kind of enjoyed.
What do you mean?
You know, I'm not answerable to my parents anymore, either of them.
The day my father died, I was driving over to his house, and I remember holding the steering wheel of my van and thinking, I'm an orphan. And then I thought, somehow empowered by that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, before we end the show, do either of you, well, I'll ask you each, if you had a piece of advice to somebody who has lost a parent, what would it be?
Mine would be to do what we were just talking about, which is to look at what you learned from your parents, both positive and negative, and see if you can take whatever the negative was and turn it into a positive, so that your life becomes an embodiment of, at some level, who they could have been if they had reached their highest potential.
I like that.
That's great.
Yeah.
I would say that writing about loss is a powerful way to get into it. I think that I actually started writing letters to my mom, and I called it Dear Dead Mother years ago. But ways to fill her in. You know, these are the things that you don't know about me or my relationship with your husband. But I think that that can be a way into feelings that we wouldn't necessarily get to without, you know, going a little deeper.
Well, thanks to you both for being on the show today. It's been just great, and keep up the good work of letting the world know about all this and being there.
Thanks to you too.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity.
And thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And thanks for watching this show today, and God bless.